After immersing myself in Quake's multiplayer world with Quake 3 and its successor, Quake Champions, I wanted to go back and review Quake 4, which would be the final mainline single-player game in the franchise. When it was released in 2005, Quake 4 got a mediocre reception. People didn't hate the game or anything, but they also felt like there was nothing to write home about. Quake 4 continues the Strogue plotline introduced in Quake 2, and fans felt like the game was a lackluster conclusion and didn't really fall in line with past Quake games. I can't disagree that it doesn't feel anything like its fast-paced predecessors, but Quake 4 is still a solid game at the end of the day. So let me get this straight. We have the Lovecraft-inspired Quake 1, which didn't receive a follow-up of any kind. Quake 2 ignored what Quake 1 set up and created a brand new story with the Strogue. Quake 3 ignores what Quake 1 and 2 set up by making it multiplayer focused and not having a fleshed out campaign, and now with Quake 4, they go back to the Strogue plotline that was established in 1997 with Quake 2. The Quake franchise was fucked from the very beginning, and it's no wonder how it ended up having such an identity crisis. Nowadays, Quake is widely known as the Arena FPS series, and Quake 4 has kinda been forgotten about in the process. That's a shame, because Quake 4 is actually a decent game. The first aspect about the game to note is how it was powered by id Tech 4, the same engine used to make Doom 3. There are a ton of similarities between Doom 3 and Quake 4, and it's almost as if that the game is actually just Doom 3.5. If you enjoy the gunplay of Doom 3, but perhaps don't like the dark environments or scary tone it presents, then Quake 4 might be the perfect alternative for you. Quake 4 opens with an impressive cutscene that sets the mood straight away. Holy shit, this gets straight to the point and it's fantastic. There are soldiers dead. The Strogue are on the back foot, but they are still giving the humans a hard fight. And you're watching this cutscene thinking, fuck yeah, let's kill some aliens. Like I said, Quake 4 is pitch perfect with its opening. The game begins on the surface of Strogos, and unlike Doom 3, it is well lit up and is nicely bright. There are some dark moments in Quake 4 where you need to bust out your flashlights, but you hardly need to rely on it to get through the game. Also, the flashlight is mounted on your machine gun, which to me strikes a good balance of having to switch to a weaker gun when it's dark, but also not being totally defenseless like in Doom 3. That's not a knock on the Doom 3 flashlight at all, by the way. I love how that mechanic works in that game, but Quake 4 is way more action-packed, so it makes sense to have a weapon-mounted flashlight. The gunplay in Quake 4 is pretty damn good, similar to most other id Software games, but the beginning movement speed is slow as fuck. When you're in the middle of combat, there isn't much of a need to move fast, so that's not really an issue, but when you're walking from objective to objective, it becomes very tedious. Luckily, when you hold down shift, you snail across even slower than your typical movement speed. Oh, I'm so glad there's a fucking walk button, but not something to get me going any faster. Spoilers, but when you get around 10 levels in, the Strogue captures the main character and begins turning him into one of the Strogue as well. However, this transformation is interrupted by your teammates, and now that you're part Strogue, you are able to run faster and you also have extra hit points. So they intentionally crippled the player for the first 10 levels so that they can give you some perks for being a Strogue? That is silly in my opinion, but at least the movement speed is now faster for the rest of the game. I still can't believe that there's a walk button out of all things, but whatever. The player turning into a Strogue is actually an excellent plot point, but outside of being able to bypass the Strogue security, they don't do anything narratively with this idea. Sure, you get the occasional comments from your teammates, but that's about it. Regardless, the Strogification process is great, and you're strapped in for every second of it from a first-person perspective. Although people don't remember Quake 4 as much as the other games in the series, everyone who has played it will say that this scene is nothing short of brilliance. Speaking of your teammates and them coming to rescue you from total strugification, they are another one of the core aspects of Quake 4. During the campaign, most of the time there is an AI companion helping you out in combat, as well as follow you around the place as you complete objectives. Even though there are health and armor pickups scattered about, in the early parts of the game at least, there are usually 2 teammates that will heal you up if you need them to. This is a fun little mechanic, and it's a nice change of pace from the typical pickups you would collect. Your teammates are actually useful in combat as well, even though they can sometimes get in your way and block your path. But if you just back up and let them pass, you'll be able to proceed, and it's not a huge problem. It's not like I've ever gotten stuck by an AI companion and the game blocked progression or anything, which is always a relief. The game's combat loop is satisfying, and it feels enjoyable mowing down the Strogue using your arsenal of weapons. Unlike Quake 2, it got me wanting to play all the way to the end. The Strogue come in a few flavors, and while the tougher enemies are rather bullet spongy, that's par for the course with Quake enemies. I like taking on the lower tier enemies the most, since they have machine guns and it feels like an actual firefight against the Strogue. On higher difficulties, I would imagine you'd have to peek behind cover a lot more and crouch to remain safe, which sounds great. As the game progresses, it starts to run out of tricks, but that's alright considering that the combat itself is still fun. The weapons that you have access to range from very entertaining to kinda clunky, but most of them are rather nice to use. The only downright annoying gun to use is the nail gun, since it not only has a long reload animation and has a wind up to it, but it's also projectile based, which makes it harder to kill enemies effectively. That being said, the machine gun, shotgun, grenade launcher, plasma rifle, rocket launcher, railgun, and lightning gun are all fantastic, and make up for the less than stellar nail gun. Unlike other Quake games, you can kinda use any gun you want, and there's not a ton of strategy involved. You don't have to memorize which enemy is weak to what gun and plan out your attack accordingly, which makes it easier to pick up and play. But at the same time, the game doesn't give anything for players to chew on. Once you go through the campaign, there isn't any incentive to change up your combat style, and while decent players will naturally weapon switch, you don't have to. This is akin to Doom 2016, and even though that's not really an issue and I love that game, after you finish Quake 4, the replayability isn't as high as the rest of the series. When you do continue on though, your teammates give you various weapon upgrades, and this is a cool little idea. An example of an upgrade would be a scope module for the railgun and other similar weapon adjustments. I would have preferred if you could find these gun mods in the levels themselves, but Quake 4 is an extremely linear game, so I understand why they wouldn't place them in the wild. There are no power-ups in Quake 4 either, which is a huge departure from the other games, but they basically make up for it with the Strogue transformation. When you're not walking in corridors and shooting at enemies, Quake 4 funnels the player into these turret and vehicle sections, and they are no doubt the low point of the game. Aside from Quake 4 being a disappointing sequel for some fans, the biggest criticism concerning the game is about these sections. The turret and vehicle segments slow down the gameplay and pacing, and they feel clunky and thrown together at last minute and don't provide any engagement to the player. With the turret section specifically, you are unable to move, so the player is just stuck there shooting bad guys for 5 minutes before the game decides you can progress. These are just nothing sections and don't add any value to the overall Quake 4 experience. In fact, it hinders the game because you just want to go back to the regular gunplay. If they were halfway decent or entertaining at least, then there would be no issues since a certain level of downtime is important in a first-person shooter. But no, they're not good. Besides talking about the gameplay, Quake 4's graphics and art style is fairly solid. During the first couple of hours, the game looks very generic and similar to other military shooters at the time. However, if you stare off into the distance, you will find that the Strogue skyboxes are fantastic, and when the game leans into more alien and abstract imagery, then Quake 4 looks quite awesome. Unfortunately, a lot of the game is set in bland military bases, and while that's not the be-all and end-all since it's an FPS first and foremost, it is still a criticism to note. The generic war theme also bleeds into the story, and for that reason, I couldn't give a shit about Quake 4's plot. I know that some people do, and that's great, good on them, I'm glad you got something out of it, but besides some funny back and forth dialogue with the soldier characters, there's nothing interesting going on with the story. Again, that's not a deal breaker because Quake 4 is a first-person shooter, and it succeeds at being a fun action game. The words I would associate with Quake 4 are fun, but uninspired, and that's a sentiment that many players share. I really did enjoy my time with Quake 4, and out of every campaign in the series, I think it has the second best one besides the original. The game feels like a more action-packed Doom 3, but it still retains some of the moody lighting and darker atmosphere, which is always good to see. I'm glad Quake 4 exists because it's a good game after all, but it kinda came and went. It wasn't the true Quake sequel that everyone was asking for, and I feel like if they took inspiration from Lovecraft again and not built off of the Stroke plotline, Quake 4 would have been looked at more fondly, especially nowadays. Quake 4 is pretty damn solid, but it has since become the black sheep, and that's sort of a shame since I liked the campaign and everything. Quake 4 also released at a time where id Software was in a dark period. Even though the game was made by Raven Software, this would be the last single-player id game for over 10 years. Sure, Quake 3 and Quake Live were still huge and there was a dedicated player base, but id Software's single-player offerings were lacking. The 2009 Wolfenstein received mixed reviews, and ever since Quake 4, there has never been another single-player Quake experience, and it's a shame to see the series in that state. From 2005 onwards, it was the dark age of id Software, although there was light at the end of the tunnel. There was still a new hope after Quake 4 came and went. The dark age of id Software ended in 2016.